I have only met Suzanne 15 minutes ago, and it's like we're old chums. I can understand, having worked for the president, why you and President Reagan got along so well. Well, good morning. I guess it's good afternoon now. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in-house to make sure your cell phones have been turned off, just as a courtesy to our guest. Oh, yes, we don't want any mass last-minute meeting calls. It's funny how many speakers end up doing that. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, emailing us at any time simply to speaker@heritage.org. And we, of course, will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Many of you may know that last week at about this same time, we hosted Ken Edelman here to discuss Reagan at Reykjavik. In Mr. Edelman's book, he discusses what you might say things inside Hofty House during that particular meeting. Our guest, Suzanne Massie, today gives us a little broader perspective of what I call inside the White House. She has the enviable record of having met at least 16 times with Ronald Reagan and spending 21 hours with him. That's an unheard of amount of time in a lot of ways during a presidential term. Of course, she brought to him understanding of the Russian culture, lessons that we can use today and many of our policymakers are probably searching for in this day and time. Mrs. Massie served as a fellow at the Harvard Russian Research Center, now called the Davis Center, from 1985 to 1997. She has also served on the board of the International League of Human Rights. She was acclaimed for her publication in 1980 of Land of the Firebird, The Beauty of Old Russia. If you're interested in the book, it's quite thick since she only deals with 1,000 years of Russian culture up until the time of the revolution in 1917. In fact, when Raisa Gorbachev was in the receiving line at the White House and she shook hands with her, it is she. It's a wonderful book. Talking about Land of the Firebird, which is one reason she got into the Oval Office, but also we're very happy to have her today to discuss another wonderful book, Trust But Verify, Reagan, Russia, and Me. Suzanne, I'll let you start. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
You have the twinkle in the eye of Ronald Reagan.
I thank you very, very much. And what I want to know is, how did you know it was 21 hours? I think it was more.
Well, I think that's what is in one of the dust jackets or in one of the...
No, 21 hours. I don't know. I never counted the time. In any case, yes, and I will. I took very seriously what I was told on this thing, that I had to speak only 20 minutes and then there would be 20 minutes for questions. So I tried to do that, only to have John tell me that he would like me to say some other things. So I would be very like some of the things, more things that I told Ronald Reagan, and also something that's very important to me and I wanted to include, and I will, thanks to John's request, about what is happening with religion in Russia, which is very important and nobody talks about it and you never see it in the newspapers. So I will do that. But right now, I thought I would tell you a little bit more about my book and about President Reagan and our relationship. In fact, I only met him in January 1984. Very significant year it was. And in fact, it didn't happen quickly. You will see, if you read my book, it took me about 17 years to do this. But anyway, I met him just before I was introduced into the Oval Office, where I found, to my horror, all the men around me. They were oozing with masculine strength, and I didn't expect that I was going to see them. There was Bush, Baker, Deaver, Meese, all of them, and they all sat down in pecking order on those white couches. And I had expected it would be very short because, you see, I was about to leave for Moscow on a back channel mission that had initiative from the White House, and I thought it would be 5 minutes. I had said the Russians are very, very personal people, and not to criticize anything that's come before. In fact, all the president's men don't add up to the president. And since it was such an unusual thing, an initiative for the first time from Ronald Reagan in their direction, and I was a woman, I thought, I really have to be able to ask the president one question and to be able to say honestly to anyone that I should be confronting that it had come from him, that I'd looked into his eyes and it had come from him. Well, they said, okay, put it on paper. Well, I did. And that's why I was ushered into the Oval Office that day. And I thought he would just say, hello, Mrs. Massie, goodbye, Mrs. Massie, good luck, Mrs. Massie, and out I'd go. No, he said, sit down, Mrs. Massie. And I was suddenly on one of those white chairs by the fireplace, and I honestly, really almost felt that my feet couldn't touch the ground. It was all so huge. And all those men sat down in pecking order. And I thought, well, I had an instant. First of all, I could feel, when you're that scared, you can feel the aura of the other person. And guess what? I felt that the president, for some reason, was nervous about meeting me. And I remembered reading somewhere that he was nervous about experts. And I thought, I want to say, Mr. President, I'm not an expert. I just know a little bit about this one little thing, but you know so much more than I do about so much else. I didn't like to be president, and I felt like I wanted to put my arm around him and reassure him. His head was sort of on the side. But anyway, I hoped I was sending out good vibes, and I made an instant decision. If I were to look at all those men on the white couches, I would be going like this. And it would be like a ping pong game. So I thought, no, I shall look into his eyes alone and pretend that we're all by ourselves. Well, he stayed. He kept staying and staying and staying, and didn't seem to want to go. And he finally was dragged off. And I said, then I asked him the question, and it was, Mr. President, if you are elected to a second term, will these small steps toward will the small steps toward better relations be a continuing policy of your administration? And boy, he looked down at me, and he had an eagle eye every so often, and I saw it the first time there, and he said, yes, if they want peace, they can have it. And I left. I was absolutely stunned. I left. And I went, all alone, to the Soviet Union. It was a time now considered by historians as the most dangerous time in the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were really inching ever closer to the brink of war. There had been a lot of things that had happened. The shooting down of KAL. The United States was putting Pershing missiles in Europe. There was Andropov had become, because of his illness, quite paranoid. There were a dozen things that were happening, and it was getting bad. And on December 13th, the negotiator, Soviet negotiator of the arms negotiations that had been going on forever and ever, simply said, it's all finished, and walked out. So there were no negotiations at all between the United States and the Soviet Union for the first time in 14 years. And of course, the cultural exchange had been stopped by Jimmy Carter when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. So the rhetoric between the nations had really gotten bitterly shrill. Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And a little aside here to say that he was much criticized in the United States, but in the Soviet Union, a lot of my friends said, right on, Ronnie. Somebody finally said it. So it wasn't so badly seen there. But anyway, and Andropov called Reagan a mutant from outer space. So, you see, it's an American myth. It's one of those favorite American myths that any American citizen could talk to the president and that he'd listen. Well, it's, it's a bit reminiscent of a Frank Capra film, although I would have put Jimmy Stewart in my place rather than me. But anyway, this did happen to me, and on top of it, I was a woman, perish the thought, at the time when no women were involved in the making of policy with the Soviet Union. And I was an unconventional woman at that, with very unconventional ideas. I was quite ferociously anti-Soviet regime, but pro-Russian people, a position which did not endear me to the officials of either side. And of course, we had made the great mistake in the United States of making Soviet and Russian a synonym and using it synonymously. Well, there was a great difference, and I couldn't help. Of course, I knew that in the Soviet Union, Russians often called their government them, and themselves we, which is quite a different thing. Now, I had been often to the Soviet Union, and there are many adventures there, which are too long to tell you now, but many, many. And I was very, very lucky when I first went in 1968 to go through the raindrops of the Iron Curtain and meet a great amount of Russian citizens, poets, artists, dancers, and lots of ordinary people, most of whom had never met a foreigner before. And this happened because I was actually met by a poet in a palace who invited me to his poetry reading, and I went. And that is what brought me through the looking glass. And I had met a lot, and I had shared their lives, and I had seen how much they suffered, how often they were afraid, what difficulties there were in life. And I saw what the tremendous misunderstandings we had between our two countries. And eventually, and this is a very interesting story, which you'll have to read in my book, I worked on trying to the Soviets took my visa away in 1972. And I asked, why? And my friends said to me, why? There is no why. Only Western people ask for reasons. Well, the only reason I can think of is because I knew all those Russians, and I liked them very, very much. And they didn't like that at all. So that was taken away. I cried for 3 days. I thought, but I knew I'd get back there somehow. But it would take a long time. Well, it did. It took 11 years because I knew I'd have to get to the top to get back. And how was I ever going to get to the top? But I am Bernese. I am very, 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 I have to say, stubborn. There is a saying in Switzerland, stubborn as a Bernese. And I am. And I was mad. I had never done anything except like their people, like Russia. And I had never done anything bad. And I thought they took my visa away anyway, bastards. And so I went to Washington to fight for it, thinking my government, it would be interesting, and that my government should really support the right of ordinary citizens of both sides to meet each other. My foot. That was the détente period. Well, in any case, I struggled, and I was struggled for 8 years. And you'll see, I was confronted by the State Department, who said, like this, it would be very inappropriate for us at this time to do anything, and that I was the single American citizen who knew the most Soviet citizens personally, as if this were somehow dangerous. Well, anyway, I was about to give up hope when who came to my rescue but the American Army, and in the form of a colonel. That is another part of my background you can read about, but I had some very good relations with West Point. And this gentleman was now a colonel, and he was in the National Security Council. And I will say that the military were the only ones who were really interested in seeing that I got back there. And he told me what he did, and this is really quite wonderful. He was the first military officer to have been able to go back on an IREX grant to the Soviet Union, and he called me and asked me for 7 Firebirds. I thought it was quite heroic, since after all, they're very heavy. And he said, then will you sign them? And he gave me this list that mind-boggling, to all the top guys of the USA Institute, including Arbatov and General Milstein and all of them. And guess then, when he came back, he said to me that he had distributed them on their desks, and they'd said nothing until finally they said, do you know this woman? And he said, yes, I do, of course. Interesting woman. We'd like to talk to her. And he said, what a coincidence. She'd like to talk to you too, but she doesn't have a visa. And then, so when he came back, he said, call so-and-so. Well, I knew that Ty Cobb was in military intelligence too, and so he'd know what doing. And so the man was Valentin Mikhailovich Berezhkov, the translator of Stalin, who happened to like the United States very, very much, and who was here in Washington. And between the two of them, they got me back to the Soviet Union. And there I saw how bad the atmosphere was. It was terrible. It really was terrible. There was such a psychosis of war, such a suspicion and a hostility, that I was really very, very disturbed by it. And at the USA Institute, Ty had told me that I should ask for a certain person. The certain person was reputed. He was the deputy director, but he was reputed to be a general in KGB. Well, I did ask, and they said, of course, no, of course, he was much too busy to see me. And then I had a brilliant idea. I said, I have a message from Colonel Cobb. Well, the door opened so fast, I can't even tell you. And he looked at me like this and said, well, and I said, Colonel Cobb sends his best regards. and hope that he'll see you at the next conference. And he said, is that all? And I said, yes. And I thought he'd throw me out, but he didn't, which started some hot discussions. And in the middle, he said to me, you don't understand how close war is. And my thoughts were, they lie. They always lie. You know, take it with 12 poods of salt. I said, but I couldn't forget it. I couldn't forget it. As it turned out later, which you can read about, he was telling the truth, and he was in a position to know. But I didn't know, but it disturbed me very much. And I couldn't forget it, and I left, and I was still trying to get permissions to work at Pavlov's to write a book, and I was getting nothing but niet, niet, niet all the time. But I went right on, but I kept thinking of it, and I went to Switzerland, and I kept thinking of it. And, you know, something woke me up at night and said, go home. So I did. And I got on a plane, and on the plane, something said to me, see President Reagan. Well, I thought I'd always told my children that anybody in the world was only 2 introductions away, so I'd better put my money where my mouth was. Well, it wasn't easy, I can tell you. I mean, you can read about that. There were a lot of convolutions, but finally, I saw my friend Bill Cohen, a senator, and we were talking about his books and his visit to Moscow, and he said, you should see Bud McFarlane. I said, yes. And in fact, I was given 20 minutes with Bud McFarlane, and that's how I met him. And I then argued. I mean, I had it in 20 minutes. I had rehearsed it because he was a Marine colonel, and I knew I had to do that. And I told him that from what I had seen, this terrible, very terrible, dangerous situation, but I also sensed that they really wanted to find a way out, and that it would have to be something completely non-suspicious, a cultural exchange again, that we might be able to talk about that. Well, anyway, after several meetings with McFarlane, and he told me, put it on paper. I did. It went to the president, a lot of things. But anyway, amazingly enough, I said, I don't know whatever possessed me, but I said, send me. I can talk to them. Well, they did, and that's how I met the president. And anyway, I had, often been there and I'd seen all this. So, anyway, I told him again how dangerous it was, something we had to do, and, I proposed that despite those harsh words, we might get somewhere. And they decided to risk it. And that's when I met him, and I did go, and that was quite a mission. I was quite pushed around. Nobody was supposed to know about it. And of course, I didn't know how far I could insist. I mean, after all, I didn't know. I wasn't very experienced in these things. So I didn't know. And I was a woman, and women of my generation were taught to defer to men. So I didn't know. And I thought, well, they all have advisors, and I'm going to get one myself. And so I took one from each side that I could trust completely. One was Admiral Inman, Bobby Ray Inman, one of the most brilliant men in the United States, who had been, of course, Deputy Chief of CIA. And the other was Bishop Radzianko of the Orthodox Church of America, a relative, Mr. Kulikovsky, who's here, who knew everything. He was broadcasting to the Soviet Union, and he was an extraordinary man, and he gave me some of the best phrases I was to use successfully there, and that you can read. Anyway, I went. I asked what I was supposed to do in Washington. Was I supposed to just sit in the hotel and wait for the phone to ring? They said yes, and it did. And it turned out it was exactly that man I had tangled with in the USA office, because unbeknownst or unrecognized by us here, it was the KGB that was in charge. And they were the ones who supported Gorbachev in perestroika, because they're the only ones who knew how bad the situation was in the Soviet Union. You'll see, I had some very interesting long exchanges with two that I called the princes of the KGB. Anyway, I never expected that my meetings with the president would continue, but they did. And over 4 years, his entire second term, he wrote me 10 letters. He called me several times, and he invited me to the White House for meetings 17 times, including a couple of private lunches with Mrs. Reagan and himself. Now, many of these meetings were 90 minutes long. I have to tell you, it's quite amazing, I had no security clearance, and nor did I ever have to sign a confidentiality paper, ever. Now, I am from a diplomatic family in Switzerland, and I tell you, I knew very much the importance of discretion in diplomacy. You cannot do diplomacy unless there is a chance for two sides to say to each other, if I did this, what would you do? Or if you did that, what would I do? And not have it appear on the front pages of the newspapers. And that went for both sides. And I'm proud to tell you that not a single word of any words that I exchanged with the president ever found their way to the newspaper. And I never, ever even talked about them until after the presidency, long after, and didn't write about them until now. Now, my book, Trust But Verify, Trust But Verify happens to be a Russian proverb that I taught President Reagan right before Reykjavik. We had a lunch right before Reykjavik, and at the end of that lunch, I suddenly got a brainstorm. I thought, well, Mr. President, I said, the Russians often like to express themselves in proverbs, and there's one that might come in handy for you in your discussions. I said, trust, but and I said, you're an actor, you can learn it in a couple of minutes, doveryai, proveryai. And I said, trust, but well, he loved it, and so did Mrs. Reagan, and asked me to write it right away down. Well, of course, we know he appropriated it, made it his own, and now it has gone into the American lexicon of things. So, this book is really a personal memoir, not an analysis of the Reagan administration. I only was able and did talk about the Reagan that I knew and that I got to know, and that was the peacemaker. And I never shared the extreme opinions of either the right or the left about him. When I first met him, I knew nothing about him. I actually considered myself an independent and leaning toward conservative Democrat. And like so many of my journalist friends, dismissed him as a lightweight actor. Well, I have to tell you that anything that has to do with Russia is long. Long stories, long histories, long church services, long names, long novels. And this, too, is a long story, which I'm trying to abbreviate. Anyway, all those times I'd spent in the Soviet Union, I always called it my worm's eye view. And in fact, it turned out that's exactly what Ronald Reagan wanted. He was a people person, the only politician that I ever met who wanted to know not what did the Kremlin think, but what did the Russian people think, what they loved, what they laughed at, how they lived. And he was just not getting that kind of information from his advisors. And he wanted to get a wider view. That was a very wise thing. I wish that were going on right now. So I told him a lot of things. I told him about the Russian people, about their history, their culture, all their art, and all the things that they held dear. One general that I very much admired, General Goodpasture, when he was coming down to West Point, asked me to come and lecture to the 4,000 cadets about Russian culture and Russian art. Because, he said, before you know what people will fight for, you have to know what they love. And that is the kind of thing I was telling the president. I was to find, the most important thing, I think, was that I was to find to my amazement that no one in that army of experts, specialists, and advisors that surrounded any president had ever told the President of the United States that the Russian people were religious and had a 1,000-year-old faith, orthodoxy, and that despite the persecutions and the attempted genocide of the church by the communist regime, they had resisted. And although constrained, the church continued to exist. In fact, remained the only non-Marxist-Leninist organization allowed to exist at all. This piece of information, which I was the first to tell him, was to make a great impression on this man who had a deep and abiding faith that guided his life and who really believed truly that the Russians were so intelligent, so sensitive, and so very original, and that if they had no moral compass, all that could go into expansionistic or in this atomic world to Armageddon. And that's his word, not mine. And so this was a very big thing for him to learn. And if we have time afterwards, I would be very happy to talk to you at a little greater length about what's happening today, which is really quite startling. Now, among the many surprises that I was to find, that Ronald Reagan, far from being the denigrated lightweight the press made him out to be, was a very complicated, thoughtful, and even enigmatic man with a long view and a deep desire for peace. A man who kept his deepest thoughts to himself. Even Nancy said that she didn't know how he came to his decisions. And often threw his advisors off guard by keeping silent. Opaque, he was often called. He was modest, very modest, and that was something I found so unusual because, after all, I'm a writer, I was a reporter for a long time, I'd met an awful lot of powerful men. And unlike many men and most politicians, he had his ego under firm control. And this modesty was part of that. He always said he was not a great communicator, that was not what he was called, but that he did have some great ideas to communicate. He was calm under pressure. And his modesty, of course, was a key to his overflowing source of humor, which was often directed at himself. How I miss that humor today. There just isn't any humor anymore in our political life. Now, having known many, many dancers, it's another part of my life, I was struck by of course, he he looked his age. I mean, he had nice laugh, wrinkles, and all that. But I couldn't get over how he could rise effortlessly at his age, in his 70s, how he could rise effortlessly from a chair. Now, that is very unusual, I can tell you. And I wondered how in the world he could be in such good shape. Unlike the other presidents we have, we never saw him sweat, ever. Now, we saw Clinton running around in his underwear. We saw Bush with his helmet on his bicycle, bicycling away. But we never saw Reagan, except he was shown horseback riding, which he loved, and occasionally chopping wood. Very dignified things to do. But we never saw him sweating. And then I learned that, of course, he exercised every single day, even when he was on the road, especially after the attempted assassination. He worked very, very hard and did remark in his diary that it was just amazing that even at his age he could increase his biceps, which was nice. But he spent a great deal of time thinking of such details. He also said something that really touched me very much. He always wore a vest in the Oval Office as a mark of respect for the office of president. And I've always thought that was extremely right to do. Now, unfortunately, these days, and from Reagan, I mean, I'd say in our modern times, our president has exponentially grown more and more like an emperor. He is surrounded with courtiers and palace guards who try to isolate him from anyone but themselves and prevent him from hearing any contrary views to their own. In fact, I can personally vouch for this fact, because you can imagine how they went after me. Ronald Reagan was forceful and courageous in defying these advisors often, to pursue his own policy and trying also to find a less dangerous relations with the Soviet Union. In fact, there would never have been a meeting with Gorbachev if he had not insisted on it, with the help of Nancy, I will say, who was behind him. Because guess what? These advisors felt that Reagan was not up to it. Well, Reagan insisted, and then he also insisted that there be no pre-summit communique, as was absolutely always accepted. He said, I do not want a pre-cooked summit. I want it to be only when after Mr. Gorbachev and I decide what will be there. Imagine, the advisors were totally aghast, and I mean on both sides too, because they had sort of the same feeling about Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. And indeed, when I was looking into this and working on this, I saw he planned every single detail carefully. And he also had said, we're not going to talk about, we're not going to talk about all that ABCs of those arms control. We're going to talk about fundamentals, why they are afraid of us, why they shouldn't be afraid of us. And he managed that. In 8 hours of meetings, 4 were devoted to meetings alone. And he and Nancy had scouted out the place they were having and found that pool house. And the president himself said that there was to be a fire burning in there all the time, because he thought it'd be nice to sit around the fire. And he actually put his arm around Gorbachev at one point and said, come on, let's us go off, alone. I will tell you that the bureaucrats were quite furious. They didn't quite know what would take place among those people and those two. But anyway, that was a brilliant move. And the other brilliant move, which could only have come from an actor, understanding the importance of a first entrance. I saw that because I was not an official person, and I had asked, I said, look, if I am successful, in breaking this ice and getting a cultural agreement to be talked about, I'd just like to see them shake hands. Of course, they put me aside very quick. But so I was doing research on a book in Leningrad, and I was seeing this meeting on a flickering television set with a bunch of Russians who had never seen the president, actually, because he was never shown, only in caricature. And then Reagan did the brilliant thing. Here was poor Gorbachev, 9 months in power, looking awfully nervous at the bottom of the stairs. And who comes bouncing out but Reagan, without a coat, without a hat, and bounces down the stairs and puts his arm around Gorbachev. The Russians almost fell over. They said, look at that, look at that. In this cold weather, a 74-year-old man without a coat, without a hat, and our man wrapped up like a bear. You know? and he said, they said, what a man is Reagan. What a man is the United States. What a country is the United States. Well, I heard that over and over in Leningrad afterwards. I mean, it was just electric, absolutely electric. And then I found out that Reagan had had his coat on, had had his scarf on, and just before, threw it off. Now, you see, he set the stage from the very beginning, and I'm happy to tell you that the only agreement that was signed was the cultural agreement at that. And that was very nice. He often said that it was better to protect people than to avenge them. From the time he became president, and from a very seminal visit to NORAD, his deepest desire was to eliminate atomic weapons. And it would become his deepest disappointment when, despite all of his efforts, he failed to do so. The story of his dedication and unstinting effort is a sad one. His advisors often laughed at him behind his back. They did everything to discourage him and frustrate his effort. And in the end, at Reykjavik, when he and Gorbachev came a hair's breadth away from that historic achievement, it was to fail, not only because of the Soviet side, but because of our side, who was quite determined. We were quite determined not to let him do that. And I will tell you, I don't think you know this. This is a sad story. Raoul Tsagdeev, you know who he is. He's the great physicist. We were going to do a talk together at the Eisenhower Institute. And he remembered this, and he said that the delegate, one of the delegates from the Reykjavik meeting, came back really quite shaken and told him that a delegate from the American side, and we only had 12, from the American side came up to him and said, thank you for stopping our president, our crazy president. To me, I mean, I was outraged when I heard that. I thought, that's treason. But anyway, it was somebody in our group that did this. Tsagdeev would not have lied. And thank you for stopping our crazy president. Well, when he came back, there were other reasons. Iran Gate had exploded and a lot of things. But basically, he was absolutely, the Joint Chiefs were very unhappy because they hadn't been invited. Lots of people were, and they were really frightened that Reagan might give away the store. And actually, the thing that was really it was so sad, the whole thing. At the end, and I read this, when I read this, I was even more shocked. Someone in the NSC at the time said that he was watched for every minute after that. He was controlled to make sure he wouldn't do anything, And I thought, we were afraid of the Kremlin. This was happening right here in the United States. And he was watched till the end of his presidency. Now, of course, they turned on me very much because I was supposed to have made this. I mean, listen, if it were not, it would be sad if it weren't, it would be funny if it weren't so sad, as the Russian proverbs say, to think that, as some of the right said, that I was the Mata Hari who had made Reagan dovish. Well, anybody who knew the president knew that he was so firm in his policies, nobody could do that. And then Izvestia went the other way completely, published on the front page of the paper that I was the woman who ended the Cold War. Also, absolutely not true. I was doing just what I told you, telling him about Russian culture and what he wanted to know. And I did meet with him before every meeting with Gorbachev. So anyway, in his visit, the press always decorated him for being an actor, but his actor's training was a precious help because actors don't seek mirror images like politicians. And in order to be good at their profession, they have to be able to get under the skin, understand the motives and emotions of someone very different from themselves. Gorbachev, in my presence, called Reagan the most intuitive and sensitive leader he had ever met, and added, "That's an actor's talent." And he used that, of course, to great effect. He really was able to see things from another person's view. I was very struck when these were at lunches where, he talked all the time at lunches, and it was wonderful. He could talk about the Soviet Union without rancor, He wanted to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish, but he didn't pour a lot of bile on it. And about Gorbachev, when he was telling me about his own impressions of Gorbachev, he said, well, he's really quite nice. And he said, of course, he believes all those things, but how could he not? That's the way he's been brought up. But no rancor. Now that, I thought, was a remarkable phrase. Anyway, in his visit to Moscow, I did coach him a lot, and he went to the Danilovsky Monastery against a lot of criticism in this country who was trying to keep him from doing it. And he spoke, and he made a speech, short but so eloquent. He spoke as no American president had ever spoken to the Russian people. His visit, in all, was a triumph. And when he left, some Russians said he would have gotten more votes there than he'd gotten in America. And I do know, I have to say that, of course, I was left behind, again, not being official, but I was so proud. I really was. I had realized how much he had taken in. I never really knew how much he took in, but he would take in what was useful to him and then, of course, use it marvelously. I really did feel as though my prize star pupil had just passed the final exams with flying colors. He was terrific. At his funeral, the most memorable thing I can remember is his President Bush, first President Bush, paid him the rare tribute of saying he never turned an adversary into an enemy. Now, in 2011, a British academic remarked that he'd always considered Reagan, quote, rather an intellectual lightweight. Gorbachev, who was there, and the adversary who had become a friend, rebuked this man, saying, "You are wrong. President Reagan was a man of real insight, sound political judgment, and courage. You can't ask for more than that from someone who started out or was thought to be his great enemy." Now, I have a lot of stories, a lot more, about these remarkable days in my book, and I do only hope that you will read it yourselves and discover some of these for yourself. I maybe immodestly believe that it has some bearing on the fix that we find ourselves in today. I personally am absolutely certain that if Ronald Reagan had been at the helm today, it never would have happened. On the horseshoe-shaped monument of his tomb on a mountain in California, overlooking the beauty of the state he loved, to the far-off horizon and the vast reaches of the sparkling Pacific Ocean, are engraved words taken from a speech he gave at the dedication of the Reagan Library that leave us with his deepest belief. "I know in my heart that man is good, that what is right will always eventually triumph, and that there is truth and purpose into every life." Now, it's a sad spectacle indeed for me to see his work, his great work, of making that the transition from the demonic relationship we had over 40 years with the Soviet Union. He made that transition. He was able not to forge a relationship of trust, not of agreement, but of trust with the first president, to be able to do that with a Soviet leader, and thus give a view to a future which might have been brighter. To see it now destroyed, and his legacy being destroyed today in the United States by lesser men, devoid of his faith or long vision, is painful. I think we all need to remember this example that he set, and his legacy and hope for peace. It's up to us now, though, to roll up our sleeves, renew our strength, sharpen our wits, and our belief in the moral, not the military, strength of America, and make sure that we don't permit this legacy to disappear for good. Thank you. Now, I can talk about the religion if you would like me to
Okay,
do
we'll
that.
let the audience, I was thinking too, the President Reagan, of course, loved jokes about the Soviet Union.
Oh, he sure did.
And when you mentioned that anybody could go into the Oval Office and meet the President of the United States, one of his favorites was, yes, Mr. Gorbachev, Chairman Gorbachev. Any citizen of the United States can come in the Oval Office and pound their fist on the desk and say what a horrible job Ronald Reagan is doing. Mr. Gorbachev said, Mr. President, any Soviet citizen can do the same thing. They can come into my office, pound their fist, and say what a bad job Ronald Reagan is doing as president.
It was wonderful, and I'll tell you another one that I told him. I brought him home jokes. I loved it. But there was one when I was trying to do all these negotiations, with this tough bird. He looked at me once and he said, well, of course, we also have trouble with exchanges. He said, you send us your best professors and we treat them as spies, and we do the opposite. Reagan took a couple of seconds and he loved it. He just said, that's great. Did one of the Russians, did a Russian tell you that? I'm going to put that in my joke book. And he did. He really did. He was wonderful about that. But you see, I saw something. I was doing lots and lots of research, and I went to the Centennial. And they'd done a brilliant job at the Reagan Library to digitalize everything. And they digitalized his, even the scratches and the things he wrote with a pipe down his throat, after this terrible operation. And that was really something. He had scratched out with a pencil, before he went on to the more serious question, he had scratched out, well, if I'd gotten so much attention in Hollywood, I would have stayed there. I love that. And only after that, the questions that he was worried about, will I be able to cut wood? Will I be able to ride? And, that's a class act, excuse me, but it is.
Oh, I think the only problem, he wore the plaid suit too much in Moscow, but that was just something everybody always objected to.
Just because you're impeccable.
No, because his plaid suit didn't always come off good in photographs. But
well, I know, it's true. I know that plaid suit. I know, but he liked it.
He did.
He liked it.
And he was wearing one the day he was shot.
Yeah.
Andrew has a microphone. He'll be glad to pass it for those who would like to ask questions. You've got to get into this conversation. We're having too much fun up here on stage, not for the audience to join us. And if you'd be so kind, maybe as to say your name and possibly an affiliation. And we have one over here.
I was late. I missed the first part, but I so enjoy your talk. Thank you so much. And my question is that what do you imagine Reagan would do facing today's Ukraine or the situation?
Well, I knew that was going to come up. I thought I might avoid it for a little while, but anyway, I have been doing nothing by talking about this. I have done a huge amount of history. I don't think it would have happened. Why? First of all, because he had established a relationship to start with. Now, you have to really realize that, of course, everything with Russia is long, and this has a long history as well, on both sides. But I think that Ronald Reagan, would have made it his business to know the history, and I have wondered, because I think that anybody with a third grade education about Russia would know that if you're going to go into Ukraine at all, you better go in carefully, and you better know that it's going to touch a raw nerve in Russia, because they've been together one way or another since the 9th century, and it would, and know what you were going to do. It's like putting a stick in a hornet's nest and then wondering, gee whiz, how am I going to get the hornets back in there? You can't do it. Now, I don't think Reagan would have done that. I think Reagan would have been much more careful. I think that he would have made it his business to learn a little bit about it. Of course, I had been telling him a lot, too, so he knew quite a lot. And I think he was able to get into the skin of somebody else and to really be able to look at it from somebody else's point of view, which we seem not to be able to do. And that makes me very sad, because I think he could have done that. And I can tell you one little story more that Mike Deaver told me this story. You know that after the Soviets shot down KAL, there was firestorm here. Firestorm, and they're terrible barbarians, blah, 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 blah. And yet, it was an accident, as we finally knew that it was an accident, and even our Air Force knew it 1 hour after it happened. And we didn't want to hear that, and. But Reagan was called back from the ranch. Deaver was with him, and he didn't want to go because he liked to stay at the ranch, and Deaver said, you have to be in Washington because American people expect that. So he got there in his jeans and Stetson hat, and as Deaver described it wonderfully, there in the Situation Room, there are the Joint Chiefs, there's everybody, and he could have done anything at all. And what he did was to stretch out in the thing, and he said, we're going to do nothing. The world will do it for us. We have to think of our long-term interests. Now, that to me is the kind of thinking he would have put to this crisis. It did not have to happen. And I'm sorry, I'm going to say it categorically because I've done the research, I've done my homework, and I've checked it. It unfortunately has a little stamp that says Made in America, and I'm very ashamed and sad for that. I don't think it had to happen. I really don't. And now, once Hornets are out of the bag, what are you going to do? And how are you going to get them back? But it doesn't look like anybody's thought about anything. I mean, if you couldn't understand that it was going to cause trouble with the Russians to overturn a bad but legally elected government, after all, to overturn it and then put in another one where you publicly knew that that had happened, and think they weren't going to get mad? I mean, of course they were going to get mad, and naturally. And not to have any, if I may say, respect for the long and complicated association of Ukraine and Russia, always, and that it was a highly complicated question that had to do with Ukraine, not with Mr. Putin and not with us. It had to do with Ukraine, that is a divided country, deeply divided, absolutely, and for the first time in its history became a state, only an independent state, only 23 years ago, and that they have not been able to find a leader to unify them or to find a way for that deeply divided country to become a nation. And it isn't yet a nation. My feeling was, if I had been asked, I would have said, stay impartial. Don't take sides. Wait to see what happens. And then, if you're going to do something, impartially try to bring the two sides of Ukraine together with the help of our allies, let's say France, England, and also Russia, as a matter of courtesy, should have been included in this. That's what I would have done, but then I'm Swiss, so, and American, and the Swiss are kind of famous for sometimes being good compromisers. And I certainly think Ronald Reagan would never have endangered the United States in that way.
Thank you. Laura Regas, friend of Heritage. One of the things that you had talked about was your impact on his understanding, President Reagan's understanding of the cultural side of Russians. Talk to me a little bit about the religious side. Did you encourage him, or did they ever attend a church service together? Or I know there was a Danilov monastery where he lit a candle, but did you show him firsthand? Did you encourage him to see a Russian service?
It's a very good question, and I tell you, he was very interested from the time I told him that. It really made a difference for him. It kind of humanized the Russians in a way to know that was it. Because I did also tell him when I came back, from some of these things, I would tell him always, there were many Russians before the meeting, the first meeting, many Russians who had come up to me to say that they were praying for the president, and he had received a letter from someone who had finally, had gotten, someone had received a letter from a relative and passed it on to him, and he said, that said that they were praying for him. He said, "Can I believe it? Is that true?" I said, "Yes, it is." And he wanted, it was important for him to know the history. This is why I really worked on that chapter called The Achilles Heel, harder than any other chapter. I may have rewritten it 15 times. I knew that Americans didn't know much about that history, that orthodoxy seems rather strange to Americans, and also because we are not very comfortable with a religion that is the identity of a people. And Orthodoxy is tied up with the identity of Russians. And we, who after all, a country of immigrants, who came here to practice many different religions, and who can change religion as if we were buying a car or something. You can go anywhere. Didn't understand at all how passionately important it was. I saw the sacrifices people made. I saw how couples who dared to want to be married in church in Soviet times had to sign the police register. Believers lost their jobs. They had to accept that. They did. It was so painful to see it, and then to have them dismissed over here as godless communists, when in fact they were suffering so terribly for their faith. Well, it is. And what's happening today, which is interesting, and now I will say that one of the most interesting things, and I've been watching things a lot, to me has been this swift return to religion in Russia. Now, it has many aspects. Some are not always maybe good, but basically the country is looking for some kind of moral underpinnings to replace that awful thing they had before, and which was so amoral. And so the church, and very many young people particularly, which is interesting, and you certainly see that if you go to church. I was going to church all the time. My diplomats never did, because you're supposed to keep, separation between church and state. And as Ronald Reagan, if I may say, once said very well, he said, separation between church and state doesn't mean that you don't use your principles and the moral principles that you know. It means it was really designed to restrict the tyranny of the state. And that is an important difference. But anyway, they have gone back, and as I told John coming in, last year, the Christian Science Monitor reported that a private, an independent poll in Europe had determined that the Russians are now the most God-believing country in Europe. 82% of Russians now say that they believe in God. 2/3 now say that they're Orthodox. Well, they may not go to church all the time, but as I pointed out, the Orthodox Church is the core of Russian culture. It's the beginning. And in fact, people who don't go to church at all somehow are Orthodox in their thinking. That's Russian. And of course, so what's been happening now is religion is taught in every single school. It's something that doesn't happen here. It is very much present, the patriarch and his right hand, who is a brilliant, brilliant young man, 49. I met him when he was 20. He was a monk. He was educated entirely at Oxford. He is brilliant. He is a great composer of religious music. And I think really that both the patriarch and him are probably the two most important men in Russia now. And of course, even Putin has now admitted that he is religious, that he was baptized by his grandmother, just like Gorbachev, and has what they call a skit in Russian, which means a retreat for a monk, if you want, on the island of Valam, where he goes. And he does consult. He has a confessor with whom he consults regularly. What that means, I don't know. Now, there's always the danger, which I know from Russian history, and I always used to say that. I never was worried that the Russians were going to become fascist, but I thought that, they could come xenophobic, and then I was not a student of criminology, but of patriarchology. because there were times in Russian history where the church had much too much influence. And so it's still to be watched, but I tell you, it's not bad, it's good. I'd rather have them believe in God than not, myself. That's my personal. And it is interesting to watch, and you have not, I'm sure, read about it in any newspaper or anything. Nobody ever talks about it. In our newspapers, all they talk about is how bad everything is in Russia, how bad they are, how this is that, and blah, blah, blah. And you never hear anything. Now, one of the hierarchs told me, I tried to check on this, there are now 800 churches in Moscow, and he said that given the population, they need 8,000. And I was there for the millennium, the only secular historian that was there, because here we were dismissing it as an outworn religion, last vestiges. My foot. If you read that I knew it would be very important, and I knew I wouldn't be around for the next one. So I was there, and I saw, at that I knew communism was over, and it was. 3 years later, it was over. And you could see it, and anyway, and of course here, it was always said that only old ladies went to church and that the KGB was all over it, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course I did point out that these weren't immortal old ladies from 1917, but new old ladies who were always baptizing their grandchildren in private, and they did, thousands of them. And the KGB, only non-Marxist Leninist organization allowed to exist at all. Of course they were all over it. However, with the Orthodox believer, you need to know that the Orthodox believer does not meet the kingdom of God through the priest, but through the liturgy. And therefore, priests leave him to his maker, the false priest. It was a very, and the church hung on, and the old ladies helped to have it hang on, and then they were very stern nannies as the young started coming back. And so that is a situation I think we should watch, because to me, as a historian, it's a tectonic shift. And while history does not repeat itself exactly, I think it goes in spirals sometimes. And there was a time when Russia was the last bastion of Christianity against the East. And we can only think what it all means now. Now, the most God-believing country in Europe becoming more and more secular, and it's a strange thing, and I think we really should talk about it, and much more than we do. And one last thing, it was an extraordinary experience just a couple of years ago when the sash purported to be that of the Virgin Mary was in Athos. And Athos had gotten it in the 14th century. They had never let it out, and they released it for 2 weeks to tour Russia. It is said now that 23 million people came to venerate it, and 300,000 in Moscow in front of the Church of the Savior. Now, what do they believe? Are they true? Do they really believe? I don't know, but I can't imagine anything like that happening in the United States, and certainly 23 million people doing anything I thought would be worth at least a line in a newspaper. But no, it wasn't. Yes, sir.
We'll do one more.
Hi, I'm Kevin Mooney with the State Policy Network. I see you have a chapter in there about George Shultz, and I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what his role. It seemed like after the defense buildup maxed out in the first term, the State Department had more influence.
Excuse me, I didn't hear about this maxed out.
My point being, in Reagan's first term, the emphasis was more on the military buildup, and it seems like in his second term, the State Department under Shultz had more influence than Al Haig did in his first term. And I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on that.
I think you're right about that. As far as my study has seen it, is that Reagan did have sort of the idea that he should build up the defenses of the United States very strong, and from that position of strength, do negotiation. I think that was a plan. Schultz, of course, was the quintessential, cabinet member, State Department person, and everything else. And he's the only cabinet member I really got to know well, which is why I devoted a chapter to him. Now, one of the things, excuse me for saying this, that struck me as I did a huge amount of reading. I practically memorized his book, which is 1,138 pages. And all of
Must be
the,
Russian, it's long.
it's very, well, hey, John Mottbox is 500 pages. I mean, I thought to myself, no, not 500, 5,000. Anyway, when you read some of those books, you really think you almost didn't need a president. They were so important. Well, I think Schultz was important. I'm quite divided on how much he really supported the president. It is said, and he says, and a lot of other people say, that he really, supported the president much more than many of the others who were always fighting and everything else. I think he probably did. But I also, my own self, really wonder whether it was as total as he seems to make it now. He was very important, and he did support the president. He didn't support originally the idea of meeting Gorbachev. He did later. But I still am left with a little question how much. But I know that he was a firm supporter of the president when there was the Danilov affair, that he made it his business to become a great friend of Shevardnadze. He really did a marvelous job that way of really getting to know Shevardnadze, and the two of them had very, very good negotiations. So, in other words, he was echoing what Reagan was doing with Gorbachev. So I would say probably he was the best in the whole group there, I think.
Well, I do thank you, Suzanne. This has been wonderful. I would love to go on forever.
No, you don't.
Yes, oh yes, I could. I've read the book, and I'd like to hear it. It's even more interesting. You occupied me so much in the lobby that we came in without a copy of the book, but we do have books available out in front.
I never was a good salesman.
And she'll be glad to sign them if you would like to spend some more time with Suzanne. But again, we do want to thank you. And Raisa Gorbachev said, "It is she." It's a wonderful book. Thank you.